Hi everyone, and welcome to today's lesson. We're going to be following on from last week where we learnt about 1 point perspective, and this week we're going to be looking at 2 point perspective. 2 point is generally a bit more useful than 1 point perspective. 1 point is somewhat limited to sort of tunnel situations where you've got, or streets, where you have kind of 2 rows of objects on either side of you blocking the horizon, and everything's converging down towards the horizon point. You're kind of looking down a tunnel or a street scene or something like that. But it can be quite limited if you're drawing an object, a standalone object, so in still life situations, or if you're drawing a building from the corner. 2 point perspective is much more useful. So when you're, mostly I'm trying to kind of work this towards our urban sketching, which we looked at creating thumbnails for in previous lessons, a few lessons before this. So we want to implement this understanding of perspective in our urban sketching. And you'll find that 2 point perspective tends to be the most useful to be aware of. Similar to last week, I don't want you to necessarily be slavish over your perspective. I just want you to have a good enough understanding that you can use it to position buildings correctly relative to each other when you're sketching. So they don't have to be dead on in terms of perspective lines. They just have to generally feel correct. A lot of the nicest urban sketches have quite loose styles. Things aren't perfect. But it's definitely useful for giving the gist of the scene and the proportions and the relationship in terms of distance between different buildings and different aspects of the landscape. So, 2 point perspective is probably the most commonly used form of perspective drawing. It's quite naturalistic, so as I say, 1 point perspective is a bit limited. It doesn't always feel naturalistic, whereas 2 point perspective feels pretty naturalistic. 3 point perspective is more naturalistic, but it's kind of over the top. It's not really that necessary. 2 point will give you a reasonably kind of natural feel, and that's what you're generally looking for. So if you're drawing the corner of anything even slightly kind of turned that isn't totally perpendicular to you, that you're not parallel to and perpendicular to, you'll find 2 point perspective more useful. So the example I'm going to be using today will be some cubes, and then we'll look at how a cube shape or kind of rectangular prism shape could be turned into a building. So to recap, hopefully you remember, or you've just watched the previous lesson on 1 point perspective. We still need to draw our horizon line. So I'm going to make it quite thick with this larger pencil just so it's nice and clear. So we've got a perspective line, a horizon line across the page. Usually kind of near the bottom of the image. If you put it at the top of the image, so if your building was down here, it would feel like you've got a sort of bird's eye view. If you put it really low, it'll feel like you're really low on the ground, like you're lying down, or you have a sort of ant's eye view. Generally, it's going to be kind of in the center of your object, kind of nearer the bottom. So if we imagine a kind of an outside scene, something like that, it'll be kind of near the bottom here. Now, we're going to be using vanishing points again like last week, but this time we used 2 vanishing points. So last week, you remember, we used a single vanishing point, everything converged out of that. This week's going to be a little bit more complex in that we're going to use 2, but not too much more complex. So these vanishing points we're going to place outside the image. So the image is here. The further away we place these vanishing points, the less distortion we'll get. We'll have a look at how distortion can affect things in a moment. So I'm going to begin with 1 vanishing point on this side and another on that side. So you'll remember that last time we had lines kind of perpendicular to us, moving away from us, converging back to a vanishing point. This time we're doing the same thing, but 2 planes of the object are going to be converging back to a vanishing point. So if I sketch in a leading edge like this, so this is going to be the edge of a cube. Last time we drew a square, and that was our starting point. This time we're going to do a leading edge. Now from the leading edge, In one direction I'm going to converge back to this vanishing point, and then in the other direction, from the other end of that line I'm going to converge back that way. Then do the same thing on the left hand side and there. Now I've got the edge of a prism and then two sides of it moving away to two different vanishing points. If it was a gigantic flat prism lying on the ground, it would go back to in sort of the point where the horizon disappears, where things vanish, like it did we were looking at last time. But in this case, I'm going to stop it. So I'm going to say the edge of this plane of the building is there, and the edge of this plane of the building is here. Now if I go over and emphasize, the shape that I've drawn, you'll see it emerges as a fairly decent, kind of satisfactory cube. You can shade in one side as though there's light hitting it. So you see that fits quite nicely in the landscape, or in this particular situation. And it's pretty easy to do. Now it can get confusing because you've got these two vanishing points. The best thing to do is to sort of play around with different objects in the same scene. So just the same as we did last week, if I put something really low down here, I'm going to have some lines converging like this, more lines converging back. Again, I'll cut off the edges of it. Now in this instance we now have another plane developing, because rather than crossing the horizon and me not seeing the top or the bottom of the object, this one sits below the horizon. So as I say, we're kind of looking over it now. So this back point will then also converge back like this, and this point, because it's coming in the opposite direction, will converge back and cross. So you end up with a shape like this. So these are the back edges, front edges, our leading edge is here, and again I could shade that in. So the best thing I find to do is just experiment with it. Just keep sketching out objects. So if we have something hovering up here above us, we'll make our leading line this big. We're going to see the bottom of it this time. And I'm just working freehand, but obviously, depending on how confident you are in your freehand straight lines, you could maybe do it using a ruler. But you can do a few more if you work freehand. So again, you can see this one's now hovering up here. We've got our leading edge, we've got the top of the box. Once again, we need to connect this vanishing point to the opposite edge, and this vanishing point to its opposite edge. So if we watch, got our line traveling there, and then this one traveling back to there. Where they cross, that's the back edge of the cube. So it's pretty straightforward. Seems fairly complex, but you just want to keep practicing it. So that's the back edge. Now we've got our cube sketched out. In this case, probably this side of the cube is going to be dark, and the bottom is also going to be dark. Something like that. You can see all these cubes sit in the same space, or not cubes, but rectangular prisms. Now, what I want to look at next is what happens if you make everything a bit too cramped. It's going to end up looking distorted. So let's create a similar situation. We've got our horizon line, then we've got the outside boundary of our image, and we're going to put, this time we're going to put the vanishing points inside the image. which you generally don't want to ever do, but in this we just want to look at how distorted things can get. So if I draw my leading edge here, or maybe let's say here, then sketch my lines back down, you see already how stretched this feels. So you've got this really steep edge cutting back down to the vanishing point. Now let's close it off here, close this one off here. If I now emphasize the edges of it, shade it in, doesn't feel entirely wrong, but it does feel distorted. And this is fine if you're going for, say, a fisheye look, because this is what a fisheye lens does essentially. It kind of shrinks everything down into a small space. But let's say I wanted to kind of create the sense of buildings going back in the distance. They're going to feel pretty extreme, so just do this quite quickly. Something like that, you can see those buildings going back in the distance. It feels quite extreme. Whereas if I go back to a similar situation to the first example, I'll draw another scene in here, but I'm going to draw a much wider horizon line. I'm going to put my vanishing points right to the edge of that horizon line. I'm going to draw an identical leading edge, but this time you'll notice that as I pull my lines going back to the vanishing point away, feels a lot more gradual and a lot more natural. So this is like when you've got you're taking a camera shot and you're kind of reasonably far away from the object. So we'll cut it off, say at this point and this point, then work over the top. So you can see that feels a lot less distorted than the first instance. The first instance can work, so for effect it's useful. As I say, it feels like a sort of fisheye effect. So if you're looking for a highly distorted image, it's good to go for. But if you're going for something fairly naturalistic, I would recommend taking this approach instead. So leaving your vanishing points pretty far out, basically. So I'll do a sort of similar situation. Something like that. So you can see how different it feels. It's essentially the same scene. It begins in the same way, but we're using different vanishing points. As a sort of side anecdote, Renaissance artists or classical artists, when they first developed perspective, would create really big, complex, they were called cartoons. They were basically plotted designs of scenes. So if you see really complex architectural scenes in Renaissance painting, they were created with these cartoons, and they would start with a very small piece of paper on a wall, and they would pull their vanishing points really far out on either side of the piece of paper, and they would use pieces of string and kind of stretch them across to get their lines, and it resulted in these really great kind of complex but naturalistic perspective scenes, and it was a difficult thing to do, but it really pays off. You obviously don't need to do that, but it's good. Basically, if you do this sort of like stretched out practice when you're creating these practice boxes, you'll find when you're working from life and you're just doing things by eye, you tend towards this kind of more naturalistic scene rather than this more distorted scene. But as I say, they can both be useful, so don't rule out either. Just use whatever you feel suits stylistically what you're working on in that moment in time. So finally, like last week, I just want to kind of work on a more complex shape. So I'm just going to do this totally sort of impulsively or randomly. Put some vanishing points far out, as I say. I've got our little bounding box here. So let's start with a fairly simple leading line. So we'll say this one goes back here. This one goes back to here. Then this time, I'm not going to go all the way to the bottom. I'm going to say this shape carries on in this direction, then stops here. Then travels back up this way, carries back up a bit higher. So I'm basically, you can see I'm using this these lines that converge back and vertical lines to make it into a more complex shape. But all these aspects of the shape, they all work in space as well. So this now becomes a more complex shape. Then all of these lines are going to be traveling back. But I might again cut back here, so there's now this little bit jutting out. Something like that. So you can see it's kind of tucking away. I'm starting to create this fairly complex shape. On this side I might go a bit crazy and put a sloping angle in, so you can put sloping things into your shapes. I might do the same thing here, then drop back down straight, lift this one up straight. So you can see I'm starting to make a really weird kind of complex shape. But it's all just adhering to the same rules that we've been looking at. So that might travel down that far, and the top edge of it maybe becomes stepped. So steps down this way. So you see I'm just using verticals and stepped lines moving back. So each step fans out and becomes slightly shallower because it's reaching the horizon line behind. Let's stop it there, have it run down. And then we can maybe create some cutbacks. So it might run back like this. Then all of these points converging back like that. We can put one final little shape that cuts back in here, like a kind of window shape. So you can see I'm fairly arbitrarily placing them. There are ways that you can kind of make things more regular, but we're just kind of having fun with this shape, making a kind of weird building shape basically. But yeah, if I kind of go over and emphasize this, should hopefully become more apparent. And hopefully make sense how it was constructed. So for your exercise, you guys just need to similar to the 1-point perspective, just mess around with these approaches. So I've left it fairly straightforward. There are lots of complex rules that you can follow when you're doing perspective, but really we just want to use perspective to be familiar with how things kind of disappear into the background of urban scenes, to help our urban sketching. So something like that, again, I'll make it like the lights coming from the right hand side, so any panel on the left hand side is going to be darker. Like this, and if I wanted to, I could kind of make up a little shadow that kind of roughly works in perspective as well, which is always a nice little touch. Say something like that approximately follows that shape. Got those two sections that jut out, the gap in between. We'd maybe have some shadows on the floor here as well. But yeah, something like that. If I zoom in, give you guys a slightly closer look. There you go, should be fairly crisp. But yeah, that's pretty much it. So it's just familiarizing yourself and not being kind of too strict with it, not getting too bogged down in the technicalities, just have fun. So you've just got those basic rules. You've got your leading edge, then your lines that converge back to your vanishing points on either side, two vanishing points we're working with along the horizon line, and then you just figure out which plane is moving in which direction, and that gives you your vanishing point. So it's the same as the way we were working in 1-point perspective, but you've just got two different faces that move in different directions in this instance. Takes a little bit of time to get your head around, but just rewatch the video a few times till it makes sense, mess around with it until it starts to click. As soon as it clicks, it's pretty easy to do. And then once you're familiar with it, you can start to implement it in your freehand sketching, and you won't need to do these sorts of technical setups. You can just kind of incorporate these sorts of this sense of things moving into the distance, getting progressively smaller into the distance. But that's it. Thanks for watching, as always. Follow the channel if you want this and more videos from other instructors to get you going with your art. If you click the link through, you can take a look at OCAD Studio page and sign up. That way you can get access to one-on-one tutorials with myself and a range of other specialists to help you improve your art. But that's it for this week, and I will see you guys soon.